You may start, Anderson.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the talk of Professor Adam Schembri. I am Anderson Almeida da Silva. I am a sign language linguist and I work as a teacher of Brazilian Sign Language at Universidade Federal do Delta do Parnaíba in the state of Piauí, in the extreme northeast of Brazil. I want to thank Evelyn for the opportunity of moderating this talk. The series of conferences Abralin ao Vivo, Linguistics Online, is an initiative of Abralin, the Brazilian Linguistic Association, in partnership with several international organizations, including the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, la Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, la Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, la Sociedad Española de Lingüística, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistic Association of Great Britain, the Società Linguística Europea, the Australian Linguistic Society, l'Association Internationale de Linguistique Appliquée, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. I would say that everyone who works in the field of sign language linguistics certainly knows Professor Adam Schembri, be it by having contact with the extensive list of publications he has, or when he is in the duty of organizing conferences, giving university or summer school classes, or just by watching him presenting in conferences about his academic productions. Professor Adam Schembri has worked in a number of institutions, developing his projects, be it as a researcher or as a professor. Nowadays, he is reader in linguistics in the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. His research and teaching experience encompasses a number of areas in sign language linguistics, including work on aspects of the lexicon, grammar, the relation between language and gestures, and the sociolinguistics of two historically related sign languages, the Australian and the British Sign Language. He co-authors and cooperates in research with other known sign language linguists, just to mention some of them: Professor Trevor Johnston, Bensi Wall, Kirsty Cormier, and Jordan Fenlon. He has also published an introductory textbook with Cambridge University Press on the linguistics of Australian Sign Language, which is co-authored with Professor Trevor Johnston. And in 2015, he co-edited a volume on sociolinguistics and deaf communities with Sue Lucas. His contributions to the field of sign language are really innumerous. So on behalf of Abralin, I want to thank Professor Adam for accepting the invitation to give this conference, which is entitled On Understanding the Paradox of Sign Language Morphology. And with no more extra words to be said, I want to pass the turn to Professor Adam, who I don't know whether he has been in Brazil or not before, but I want to welcome him virtually to our country. Thank you, Professor Adam.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Anderson. I have been to Brazil, actually, for the TISLA, the Theoretical Issues in Sign Language Research Conference in 2006. I'd like to thank Abralin for the invitation to present today, and also LAGB, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, for inviting me to participate in this series as well. I'm really the topic today, understanding the paradox of sign language morphology. Maybe the title promises more than I can actually deliver, because I'm hoping today to instead ask a lot of questions about the nature of sign language morphology. In particular, I'm very grateful for Anderson for already mentioning some of my collaborators, and in particular for this presentation, much of the work that I will be referring to is work that has been co-authored with Jordan Fenlon, Kiersey Cormier, and Trevor Johnston, who were already mentioned in the introduction. Okay, so to give an overview of the talk today, I will start by giving a little bit of background for this topic, and in particular introduce a new project that is starting next year here at the University of Birmingham called the SignMorph project, which is funded by a 5-year European Research Council advanced grant. So that project starts next year here at the University of Birmingham. We have just advertised for the first job on that project. And really my aim today is to ask some of the questions, the kinds of research questions, to talk about the research questions that inspired the project. So I'm not assuming very much background knowledge about sign languages. I really see my audience today as linguists who may not be that acquainted with sign languages. So I'm going to try and give lots of examples about sign language morphology. I will then talk about the paradox of sign language morphology, what this actually refers to. I'm going to then describe a particular subset of the morphology of sign languages, what are called agreement verbs or indicating verbs. I will then talk about the notion of sociolinguistic typology from the work of Peter Traugott that partly inspired this project, the SignMorph project. And I will end by looking at the types of questions that I hope the SignMorph project can address. So really, through my research career, really over the last 20 years or so since I finished my PhD, my question has been, okay, so in linguistics, we know that sign languages are languages. This is a well-established fact. This has been widely accepted within linguistics for a long time. I still think that linguistics in general is yet to take this knowledge fully on board, but certainly it's acknowledged that sign languages are real languages. But my question has always been, well, what kind of languages are they? So sign languages are languages, but what kind of languages are they? And by that, I don't mean to kind of fetishize sign languages in any particular way. What I mean is, by what kind of languages are they? I'm really saying, how well do the tools that we have for describing spoken languages work when it comes to understanding sign languages? Now, I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to share my screen for a moment and show you one particular slide. I won't be showing you many slides through this presentation. I'll mostly just be a talking head, but I'm going to show you this slide. I don't seem able to share the screen, actually. It says, I'm getting a message saying the host has disabled the screen. Okay, so I will just not show the slides. I will summarize. Sorry?
Can you please try again?
Right, great. Okay, can you see the slides? I'm not sure if that worked. Did that work?
Not yet. Can you?
Okay, never mind. I can't seem to get it to work, so I'll just summarize what's on the slide. Okay, so how do we answer the question, what kinds of languages are what kinds of languages are sign languages? Well, I think there are three things that we need to consider. First of all, there is the properties of the visual gestural modality. So obviously sign languages, unlike spoken languages, exist primarily in the visual gestural modality. The second point is sign languages as relatively young languages. It's generally accepted that sign languages as a group of languages are fairly young. Most linguists work on the assumption that the oldest sign languages are no older than 300 years old, for example. We can talk a little bit more about that issue and problematize it a little bit later. And thirdly, the unique sociolinguistic situation of signing communities. So by this, I mean the fact that, for example, in sign languages such as British Sign Language, the sign language used here in the UK, the majority sign language in the United Kingdom, many deaf signers acquire the language not from parent to child transmission, but from peer-to-peer transmission. They often learn BSL from other children in school. And in fact, a vast majority of adult signers in the British deaf community have not acquired a BSL from a signing family environment from birth. So this makes them quite unlike other language communities. So the three things I think that make sign languages distinctive are these three aspects: the visual gestural modality, the relative youth of sign languages, and the sociolinguistic situation. The particular combination of these things is rather distinctive. And I'm interested in how have these things that are distinctive about signing communities and sign languages, have they had any impact on the structure and the use of sign languages? From a theoretical linguistic standpoint, of course, this question is really important. What kind of sign languages are? This question is very important because sign languages offer an important test case for theories of language universals and also linguistic diversity. So we often see linguists who are interested in these different aspects of language universals, language diversity, appealing to sign languages as some kind of test case. So for example, in the famous paper by Nick Evans and Stephen Levinson from 2009, there was a claim in the paper that sign languages lacked pronouns, for example, and they tried to argue the case that this means that pronouns are not a language universal because sign languages, they claimed, don't have pronouns. We actually, Kirsi, Cormier, Beuzeville, and I actually addressed this in a paper several years later. We don't think that's the case, but this is just an example of the types of questions that are often people attempt to answer by using data from sign languages. Understanding the nature of sign languages is also important for lots of applications of sign language linguistics. In particular, as someone who learned Australian Sign Language as Auslan as a second language as an adult, I have first-hand experience of 3 years of language instruction, sign language instruction. So I've always been interested in how sign language linguistics can contribute to applied sign language linguistics, particularly sign language teaching. How can we improve sign language teaching by providing more of an evidence base to the teaching of sign language grammar, for example? And very important, the question about the nature of sign languages is also very important because the unique sociolinguistic situation of signing communities is not just a theoretical interest, of course. It's very much the result of the oppression and marginalization of sign languages. So we are in this situation where the age of acquisition of many of sign language by many deaf adults is extremely variable because of the fact that sign languages have been so marginalized over the last century or so. In particular, they have not been the language of instruction in deaf education in many parts of the world for some time, and deaf children continue to struggle to get access to sign languages even today in many parts of the world. So this is a real issue. So when I discuss the sociolinguistic situation of sign languages, it's not just a theoretical issue, it's a real pressing concern. Okay, so as I said, my attempt to answer some of these questions is going to be a big part of the SignMorph project. And the SignMorph project aims to better understand similarities and differences in the grammar of sign languages and how these are shaped by both language internal and language external factors. And I'm going to talk about some of those language internal and language external factors in more detail a bit later. But in particular, SignMorph attempts to address this question by focusing in on the sociolinguistic situation of sign languages and looking at three major types of signing communities. The first type is what I call the established macro community sign languages. And by established there, I only mean really, you could replace the word established with older, relatively older sign languages, or relatively more institutionalized sign languages. That's what the term established means in this context. Macro community too means that they are sign languages used across an entire nation state. So for example, we have BSL in the UK, we have Auslan in Australia, the majority sign language of the Australian deaf community. And of course, we have Libras in Brazil. So these are what I call macro community sign languages. They're used across an entire nation state. Often, of course, there's a lot of variation within those sign languages, regional variation, etc. But we can still talk about there being some kind of national sign language. Okay, so first of all are the established macro community sign. These are the sign languages that have been the most well documented and well studied. They exist in contrast with a second type of sign language called established micro community sign languages. So these are sign languages often used in a small village type community in the global south, in countries in the global south. And they are established because they've been used for many, many generations. So examples of these established micro-community sign languages include Kata Kolok from Indonesia, and also Adamarobe sign language from Ghana. So these are two documented village sign languages that have been handed down within those village communities over a number
Mm-hmm.
generations. And one of the key differences between the established micro-community sign languages like Kata Kolok and BSL is that it's quite possible that a lot of the deaf people in the Kata Kolok community, for example, a lot more of the deaf people in that village are exposed to sign language from birth. Okay, so we don't know the exact figures, but it's likely that a much larger percentage of those deaf people in the Kata Kolok community are exposed to sign language from birth compared to the BSL community. And the third type of community are what's called the emerging sign languages. And again, by emerging, we just mean young. Okay, so these are sign languages that have emerged or have begun to develop in those communities only in the last few decades. The most famous example of an emerging sign language is Nicaraguan Sign Language. But also I have some personal experience of Cambodian Sign Language. I worked in Phnom Penh in Cambodia for 1 month working on the deaf development program there. And Cambodian Sign Language is a language that has emerged only in the last 3 decades in Cambodia. Okay, so the key difference between the emerging sign languages and the other 2 categories, of course, is language age. So the idea of the SignMorph project is we want to look at these 3 different signing communities because we want to be able to compare and contrast communities that have a different social structure, different patterns of transmission of sign languages, and also different languages of different ages. The SignMorph project aims to look at those 3 aspects of sign languages that I mentioned in the beginning, the visual gestural modality, in particular the role of iconicity in sign language morphology, the age question, the relative youth of sign languages, and how their relatively short history has impacted on variation and change in morphology. And thirdly, the social structure of those signing communities. Okay, so as I said, I'm not assuming that I have an audience of linguists that are very well acquainted with sign language structure. So I'm going to give a little bit of background now about the morphology of sign languages. And the key thing, first of all, to understand is that it's generally accepted that signs in BSL and other sign languages are composed of contrastive hand configurations. So each sign has contrasts in hand shape and orientation, locations on the body or in the space around the signer, the movement of the hands, and in non-manual features such as mouth actions, facial expressions, movements of the head and body. So for example, on the slide, I have an example of a sign in BSL that contrasts only in location. It has the same hand configuration, the same movement, and it's not specified for any particular non-manual features. These 2 signs only contrast in location. I'm going to show you those signs now. The first sign is the sign meaning afternoon in BSL. Oh. Okay, so you would have seen the slides there. So the sign afternoon looks like this. The sign name looks like this. So you can see they contrast only in location. Now it's these very formational features, hand configurations, movements, locations, and non-manual features that exhibit a wide range of alternations that convey key differences in meaning. And many of these morphological patterns, as it said on the slide, are very similar across different sign languages. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of the way that this system is used to create sign language morphology. One of the well-documented systems in sign language morphology that has been documented for a majority of sign languages is verb directionality, which is the fact that a subset of verb signs in many sign languages can have their initial and final location modified spatially to signal different contrasts in subject and object or agent and patient. So for example, this sign in BSL for ask looks like this. And you can change the initial location and the final location. So I could use that sign and direct it back towards me from a location near the addressee, like this. Okay, and that could mean you ask me. So this is a very common system documented for many, many sign languages. Another way that these contrastive hand shapes, movements, and locations are used to create sign language morphology is in the so-called classifier constructions or depicting verbs, okay? And these are very rich, morphologically rich signs in the sense that often in these signs, each of the individual components, the hand configuration, the movement, the location, non-manual features, each can have a particular meaning, okay? And so these are very rich. You can see an example here. Great. So you can see an example there of a classifier construction in BSL. And you can see that the two hand shapes represented two individuals and their relative location with each other and how they moved, one person moved past the other. Okay, so this is a very common system cross-linguistically. Okay, another type of sign language morphology is reduplication, which is often used. For example, you can get some signs that are reduplicated to show plurality. You can also, noun signs, for example, can be a subset of noun signs can be reduplicated to show plural. You can also get fast or slow reduplication of some verb signs to show, for example, habitual versus continuative aspect. So you get those contrasts in movement. Okay, so these are examples, all of these, the verb agreement system, the classifier construction system, are examples in which you get sign internal alternations to show differences in meaning. The reduplication, of course, you get repetition of a sign to signal differences in number or in aspect marking. But you also get some, so you can also get affixal morphology. So you can get some examples of affixation. And I'm going to show you one example in BSL that I'm very fond of, okay, in here. Okay, so you can see there that we have the sign agree, which looks like this. Then we have a negator sign that looks like this. And then we get the two signs together to make disagree, and it looks like this. Okay, so that's an example that's often analysed as a kind of negative suffix in BSL and Auslan. Those signs are both. That sign is found both in Auslan and BSL. Okay, so what is the paradox of sign language morphology that is in the title? Well, okay, so the term comes from a paper by Aronoff, Meyer, and Sandler from 2005, in which they made the observation that sign languages seem to be mixed systems. Although they are relatively young languages, they have a lot of they have a lot of complex morphology, such as the agreement verb system and the classifier construction system. And these, in particular, verb agreement is often believed to take a great deal of time to emerge in spoken languages. Okay, so often it's considered that many verb agreement affixes in spoken languages appear to have developed historically from separate lexical items. So we get a system that gradually develops over time that eventually develops into some kind of agreement marking system. Okay, and yet in sign languages, which are relatively young, we see this verb agreement system. And we're going to talk about the fact that actually this system emerges quite quickly in emerging sign languages if the evidence from Nicaraguan sign language, as the data from Nicaraguan sign language seem to suggest. So the system seems to emerge relatively quickly. So on one hand, we have this complex morphology that one would only expect perhaps in an older language. But on the other hand, we don't have a lot of affixation. We don't have a lot of obligatory marking of various grammatical categories in sign languages. So in some ways, sign languages do appear to be like young languages. There's not a lot of particular types of affixal morphology that one might expect. But on the other hand, we have this very rich verb agreement system, classifier construction system. And so Aronoff and his colleagues said basically sign languages seem to present this impossible combination of Navajo-like features and also Tocpizin or Creole-like features, and that this represented some kind of typological puzzle. Okay, so their explanation for this paradox was that sign languages have two roots to morphological complexity. One was the fact that sign languages are visual gestural languages, means that iconicity kind of allows for a complex morphology to develop much more rapidly than you might expect. And yet the relative youth of sign languages, on the other hand, means that there hasn't been sufficient time for a lot of affixal morphology to emerge through the processes of grammaticalization. The issue that I have with the original claims by Aronoff and his colleagues is that he doesn't really ever define morphological complexity. So they don't actually define what they mean by morphological complexity. And in fact, I'm very interested in this issue, but I must admit that I feel that referring to these phenomena as morphological complexity, we have to be very careful about the use of this term. I think we have to be much more specific about what we mean when we're talking about morphological complexity. Now, I think what Aronoff and colleagues meant in 2005 by morphological complexity is the idea that there is a lot of, inside an individual sign, you've got a lot of morphemes producing different meanings. Okay, so if we look at the Auslan sign help, okay, which looks like this. Okay, I can direct that sign from you towards me to produce a sign meaning you help me, and it would look like this. Okay, and so what we can do is we can analyze the initial location as a morpheme representing second person singular, the final location as a morpheme representing first person singular, and the sign help, of course, moving between those two locations. So we can come up with perhaps 3 morphemes in that sign, okay? And that's a lot like the examples, this might be compared to the examples in Turkish. So if you could show the following slide with the Turkish example on it, that's slide 20, please.
Just a second.
Sorry.
Adam, can you please tell me whenever you want to show a slide, because then I can show the correct slide, okay?
Yep.
Thank
so
you.
this is the slide with the Turkish example on it. Slide 20. Okay, so basically the slide shows that a Turkish word like tezyelerim, okay, consists of 3 morphemes. Teze, meaning my maternal aunt, and please forgive me for my pronunciation, okay. Ler is the plural morpheme, the plural suffix, and im is the first singular possessive. And so you get, in this particular word, you get a concatenation of 3 morphemes, okay. So this is similar to, right, here's the example. Great, thank you for that. So both the Auslan sign, you help me, okay, and the Turkish example for my maternal aunts, both can be analysed as having complex internal structure. And so this is clearly the type of morphological complexity I think that Aronoff et al. Are talking about. So how did this internal structure come about? Well, the development of verb directionality, as I alluded to earlier, has been studied in emerging sign languages such as Nicaraguan Sign Language. What's really interesting about the data coming from the development of this system in Nicaraguan Sign Language is the fact that, that in the first generation of signers in the Nicaraguan sign community, you may get verb signs that do not show any alternations in location. Okay, so you might get the same form being used in a number of different contexts and not being modified to show agent and patient roles, for example. But then over the following generations, I believe the studies have compared the first, second, and third cohort of signers in the Nicaraguan Sign Language community. You gradually see a change across time from a system in which the signs are not modified spatially to one in which eventually the signs move around in space. And in particular, the system develops the use of abstract locations away from the body to signal third person to third person agreement. So for example, this might look something like this. In the case of Auslan, I might establish, okay, John on my right and Mary on my left, okay, and then move the sign help in Auslan in this way. Okay, so here what you've got is 2 locations in the signing space being associated with absent reference, and then the sign being directed backwards and forwards between those 2 locations off the body. Okay. So the data from Nicaraguan Sign Language shows that this takes some time to emerge, but despite the fact that it takes time to emerge, what's really quite interesting about it is it seems to develop quite quickly, so that you've got Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is still a relatively young language, developing this system in just a couple of generations. This seems to be quite different from verb agreement in spoken languages, which often take a long time to develop through the processes of grammaticalization. So this seems to lend some support to the claim by Aronoff and colleagues that iconicity perhaps leads to the rapid development of sign internal complexity. However, when we look at one of the oldest sign languages, British Sign Language, BSL, the picture that we get of the verb directionality is a bit more complicated than this. So actually we found in a large-scale study of data from the BSL corpus that in fact a strategy of using abstract locations away from the signer's body is not the preferred strategy used by signers in our data set. Even when there's third person to third person reference of the type that I showed you with John helps Mary, for example. What we found instead is that quite often the sign appears without any directionality at all. It occurs in its citation form without any clear spatial modification. And when there is modification, often it tends to be modified only for the object or the patient role, with the body occupying the subject or agent role. Okay, so we get this strong preference for one of the arguments, in particular the subject or the agent, to be represented by the signer's body. So even though we may have established John on one side and Mary on the other, we get the sign help being directed from the signer's body to the location associated with the patient or the object argument. So if you could show the next slide, please, slide 24 with the graph. Okay, so what you saw there was that out of 238 verbs in the BSL corpus that were used in third person to third person contexts, only a very small number actually used the two locations away from the body. So although this doesn't contradict what the data from Nicaraguan Sign Language seem to suggest, obviously both Nicaraguan Sign Language and BSL can use these abstract locations off the signer's body, but both are grammatically acceptable constructions. What's really interesting is that they do not seem to be the preferred strategy used by signers in this older sign language. So this is one of the, this study really led me to applying for the funding for the SignMorph project, because one of the key things I wanted to understand a little bit better is we need to have similar data from emerging and established sign languages in order to be really able to compare the systems in those two types of languages. So it's quite clear that the established sign language BSL, although it uses this third to third person marking, doesn't prefer this strategy. So we need to understand more about not just the structures that are possible in emerging and established sign languages, but also their use, how much variation there is in their use. So the data suggests from BSL that the use of the abstract locations is not obligatory in BSL. And so that it's actually a dispreferred strategy. Okay, so this is clearly the type of sign language morphological complexity that Aronoff was talking about. But there is recent research on sign language, morphological complexity, which extends this notion of complexity in new ways. So in particular, over the last couple of decades, many linguists have been interested in morphological complexity, referring to something other than just morphological, rich internal lexical structure. In particular, Peter Traugott has proposed that other factors are relevant for an understanding of morphological complexity, and these are the following four features. First of all, irregularity. Okay, so how irregular is the morphological system? I'm going to talk about this in relation to BSL and Auslan in a moment. How much allomorphy is there in the system? How much variation in morphemes? And how predictable is that allomorphy? Redundancy. How much redundancy is in the morphological system? How often are elements repeated, for example, within a clause? And how many grammatical categories are marked morphologically in the language, such as tense, gender, voice? Okay, so these four things: irregularity, unpredictable allomorphy, redundancy, and morphological marking of categories are all additional elements of morphological complexity that interest Traugott and other researchers interested in the question of morphological complexity. Why are these of interest? Because Traugott and others have claimed that these aspects of morphology are challenging for adult learners to master. So I have on the next slide, slide 26, an example of this kind of complex allomorphy from the indigenous language of Northern California, Atsugewi. So you can see in this language, verbs fall into different classes. They take different suffixes, and the relationship between the suffixes in class 1 and class 3 is not transparent, okay? So there doesn't seem to be any kind of systematic relationship between the suffixes in the different classes. On the next slide, we can see an example from Flemish. If you could show the next slide, please. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, it's not there. Sorry. Okay, so in Flemish, for example, you get the repetition of you get subject tripling in first person plural. So, for example, in East Flemish dialects, you can get the subject morpheme attaching to a modal, as well as occurring as a separate word. So in effect, what you get in East Flemish dialects is a repetition of pronominal information. So for example, we shall do that in East Flemish dialects comes out as something like we shall we do that, okay? So there's a repetition of there's not only an affix of the first person plural attaching to the modal, but also you get repetition of the first person plural in the clause. So this is an example of the kinds of redundancy you can get in complex morphological complexity. Okay, so let's have a look at Auslan and BSL and look at them in terms of these definitions of morphological complexity, these additional aspects of morphological complexity that Traugott has proposed. Now, obviously, I am really moving very quickly through a description of sign language morphology. Characterizing the morphology of sign languages is a hugely controversial topic. There's still a lot of disagreement about the way morphology is best characterized in sign languages. I am using fairly standard terminology, talking about classifier constructions, agreement, verbs, for example, but I'm actually in print myself in previous publications talking about problematizing these notions of agreement and classifiers in sign languages. But I'm just using those terms because these are the most common terms that we use. So if we're thinking now about Traugott's notion of morphological complexity, these additional factors of irregularization, unpredictable allomorphy, etc. What do we see in older macro community sign languages such as BSL and Auslan? Well, we don't see a lot of irregularity in the system, in the grammars of BSL and Auslan. So for example, we do get a little bit of irregularity in negative forms, for example, in BSL. I'm going to show you the example of the modal should in BSL, and then I'm going to show you the negated form should not in BSL. And you'll see that the two forms are quite distinct from each other and are not clearly related. So I'll show you should first and then should not. Okay, so you can see that the forms are quite unrelated. So this is an example of irregularity in the system. Similarly, in Auslan, we have the sign for have, and we have the negated form have not. Okay, And the negated form have not is its own specific form, which is quite different. So from the form have. So I'll show you the form have and then have not in Auslan, and you can see the irregularity in the system. Okay. So have, you can see clearly, okay. You might expect, for example, that have not might be a reversal of the movement of have by opening up, but it doesn't actually work like that. You get only a partial opening of the hand. So this is an example of irregularity in BSL and Auslan, but there aren't that many examples of this kind of irregularity in the language. There's a lot more regularity in the system than you can find examples of irregularity like this, but they're few and far between. What about unpredictable allomorphy? Well, again, we get a lot of predictable allomorphy in BSL and Auslan. In particular, we've done studies of the first person pronoun in BSL, which looks like this. It's a point using an index finger towards the chest, okay? And you get a lot of highly predictable allomorphy in this form due to conditioning from the previous or following sign. So often the following or the previous or following sign will influence the hand shape. So you get assimilation of hand shape in the first person singular. So for example, you might sign I don't know, something like this. Okay, in which the index finger changes hand shape to match the hand shape of the preceding sign, not no. Okay, so this is a very predictable type of allomorphy. There are examples of unpredictable allomorphy. One of my favorite examples is in Auslan. In one particular dialect of Auslan, you get allomorphy in the sign give. So for example, there are two ways to sign give me in this dialect of Auslan. You can sign it like, and I'll show you what those two forms look like. Now it's the second form, give, with this Y hand shape that is quite irregular. Traditionally in Auslan, this could only be used with a first person patient or first person object. So you cannot produce the sign give you by taking that sign and directing it towards the addressee. It doesn't work that way. It's only used with first person object or patient marking. Okay. So in effect, you have two allomorphs of the sign give me, which I showed you earlier. Okay, but the system is irregular. You don't have the same two allomorphs of the sign I give you. Okay, you only have one. Okay, so the system is a little bit irregular. Okay, what about redundancy? Okay, well, when I talked about the classifier construction system or the agreement verb system in Auslan and BSL, these represent kinds of redundancy in the sense that, for example, you might get arguments established in locations in space with a noun sign, and then you've got the verb directed between those two locations to show the argument structure of the verb. So in a sense, you've got redundancy built into the system there. Similarly, with classifier constructions, there's a little bit of redundancy in the sense that the classifier hand shape refers to the category, for example, of one of the arguments, whether it's a vehicle, a human, for example. So you get this kind of redundancy in the system. You also get the use of constructed action. Our study on verb directionality in BSL showed, for example, that constructed action, which is a type of enactment in which the body and the face represents, for example, the affect or the emotions of one of the arguments of a verb, okay, that can co-occur with verb directionality. So you get this rich layering, this rich system of redundancy, so that both the location of the verb of the directional verb, and the non-manual marking can represent the agent aspects of the agent argument. So you do get some of this redundancy. However, what's really interesting is that you also get a lot of argument drop in lots of clauses in Auslan and BSL, so that often, for example, the directional verb or a classifier construction might be the only part of a particular clause. So it's not obligatory that, for example, the nominal argument occurs within the clause. So even though there's redundancy built into the system, often you get a dropping of arguments so that the clause looks overall less redundant than you might otherwise expect. On to the notion of morphological categories. Okay, neither BSL nor Auslan have morphological markers for gender, for tense, or for voice. So temporal information in these languages is conveyed by separate time signs. So it's not conveyed morphologically. Defocusing of agent arguments occurs by argument drop. Again, so the functional equivalent of a passive in BSL and Auslan, again, is a periphrastic, a phrasal construction, not a morphological one. Classifier handshapes are a type of nominal classification that's similar to gender, but this is only found on a subset of constructions. So again, a lot of morphological categories do not appear, there's not a lot of morphological marking of grammatical categories in these languages. Okay, so overall, it might be argued that languages like BSL and Auslan have signs, many signs which show quite complex internal structure, but like many other languages such as Mandarin or Thai, there's not a great deal of the Traugott type of morphological complexity. So while sign languages are undoubtedly morphological complex in the Aronoff and colleagues sense, we do need to understand much more about the variation and change in that morphological complexity. So as I said before, we need to understand the use of this agreement verb system in emerging and established sign languages a lot better. At the moment, we don't really have comparable data from emerging sign languages and established sign languages. However, it's interesting that the types of morphological complexity that Traugott talked about, which are found in some spoken languages, but not all, as I said, many spoken languages do not have the Traugottian type of morphological complexity. They don't appear to be present in older sign languages like BSL and Auslan. So obviously, part of the explanation for this might be language age. Obviously, even though these are older sign languages, they're still comparatively young. But what I think is really interesting is that Traugott's work makes a link to social structure as being another explanation for the emergence of this type of morphological complexity. Now, Traugott not the only person to talk about this, but he did introduce the term sociolinguistic typology to talk about this, the fact that it may be the social structure of speech community, of language communities, which can influence this, the presence of this type of morphological complexity. So this approach assumes that the cognitive skills involved in language processing and production are the same for all humans, but that these skills produce different types of languages in different places and at different times in history, partly due to the influence of varying social structures. So in particular, Traugott and many other colleagues who work on this notion of morphological complexity suggest that languages which appear to have undergone extensive acquisition by adults as an additional language appear to have relatively less inflectional complexity. So for example, if we compare the major world languages, English and French, to their ancestor languages like Old English and Latin, we can see that there has been a change in terms of, for example, those older languages had a rich system of case marking, morphological marking of case, that has diminished considerably in English and French. Okay? So languages like English and French only have moderate to low levels of this type of morphological complexity compared to languages like Atsugewi, for example. And that the hypothesis is that this is because these languages have had large numbers of adult second language speakers throughout their history. Traugott develops this notion by talking about the fact that in contrast to languages like English, languages like Atsugewi that have this kind of complexity, the irregularity, the unpredictable allomorphy, the extensive morphological marking of grammatical categories, okay, they reflect a different type of social structure. So often these communities that have this kind of morphological complexity are small communities. They consist of communities with very dense social networks. Okay, so people live in a small community and everyone knows each other and people have a lot of contact with other people in that community. There's a high level of social stability. So the language has been passed down within that particular community over many, many generations. And there might be language contact with other communities, but often in these types of communities, although an Atsugewi speaker, like for example, many speakers of indigenous languages in Australia, many of them are highly multilingual, but this multilingualism is something that people acquire from childhood. So they grow up learning the languages, their own language and the languages of the neighboring communities, so that although there's a lot of language contact, it's quite stable language contact, that meaning that many people grow up as multilingual within those communities. This is different from the fact that what Traugott is pointing out in the history of English, where there has been periods of large-scale second language acquisition by adults of the language. Okay, so how do these predictions for morphological complexity bear out in terms of sign language communities? Now, this is a really interesting question, and I think this is something that is relatively unexplored in signing communities. So if I think about the BSL community and the Auslan community, which are the communities that I know best, obviously, if we're talking about community size, they are relatively small communities compared to the languages of the surrounding communities. So in both communities, we have English as the majority language used by hearing people in the UK and Australia. And of course, English is a language with millions of speakers all over the world. And yet languages like BSL and Auslan number in the tens of thousands, perhaps in those particular, so they're relatively small communities. What about the social networks in those communities? Well, it's really interesting to think about what the social networks are going to be like. It's undoubtedly the case that there are deaf people within the BSL and Auslan community that have quite dense social network ties. So for example, if we think about some deaf people, they may come from deaf families with deaf parents and deaf siblings. They may have a deaf partner. They may have deaf children. They may work in a deaf organization. Okay, so these individuals have a lot of contact with other signers every day. But then there are many deaf people who might, for example, work in a hearing organization as the only deaf person. They might have a hearing partner. They might have hearing family. And it might be that they only use BSL or Auslan with their friends when they get together with their signing friends. And so their network ties with the signing community might be a lot more loose, for example. They might not have the same kinds of dense social networks. So what we don't know really is what is the balance of these individuals in the BSL and Auslan community. We don't really know what the balance of these people with different social network ties is in these communities. No one's really looked into this question. In terms of stability, it has to be said that the intergenerational transmission of both BSL and Auslan is a lot less stable now than it was in the past. Okay, so we've seen the deinstitutionalization of deaf education. So we've moved in the UK and Australia from systems where in the early 20th century and mid 20th century, many deaf people were educated in residential schools for deaf children, in which deaf children from hearing families were exposed to other deaf signers, okay, as soon as they entered the school. And so you have this well-established peer-to-peer transmission over several generations. So in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've seen a significant change in the transmission of these languages. So we often get the mainstreaming of deaf children, and some deaf children, for example, come from hearing families that may not sign, and they may be one of the few deaf children in their school, and they access their lessons, for example, through a sign language interpreter or a team of sign language interpreters, none of whom themselves perhaps are heritage signers. They might be new signers who have acquired BSL or Auslan as an additional language as adults. Obviously, also Auslan and BSL exist in have high degrees of language contact with English, but it has to be said that that is fairly constant throughout the history of the language, of the languages. One additional factor that isn't considered in the Traugottian model is the fact that, as I've mentioned before, unlike other types of language communities, because of the marginalization and oppression of sign languages, because many deaf people do not have access to sign languages from birth, and because of their deafness, they may not acquire the spoken language of their surrounding community, which means we often find examples of language deprivation in deaf communities. So what we see is that the situation of deaf communities is quite unlike the sociolinguistic situation of spoken language communities, because we have a range of signers, from heritage signers that may come from multi-generational deaf families that have signed, okay, so they might have parents and grandparents that signed, right through to deaf children from hearing families who have not had access to a sign language until relatively late in their childhood, or perhaps even in their early adulthood, and may have experienced certain degrees of language deprivation. So we have a huge range in the social structure, the sociolinguistic situation of signing communities. So together with hearing adult learners of Auslan and BSL, like myself, deaf signers with varying ages of acquisition are the majority in the signing communities in BSL and Auslan. So my question is, okay, if we don't see some of the morphological complexity, the irregularity, the redundancy, the unpredictable allomorphy, if we don't see that, is it because of language age? This is a possible explanation, that there simply hasn't been time for these kinds of complexities to emerge in sign languages. But it may also be that because of their particular ecological niche, that sign languages, in effect, remain relatively transparent in their morphological systems, kind of streamlined, with relatively little irregularity, relatively little unpredictable variation and redundancy, in order to maximize the potential for acquisition by adults who come to sign languages at various ages with varying backgrounds. So we could see the fact that this is another factor that hasn't really been taken into consideration, the fact that the sign languages fit perfectly into this sociolinguistic ecology. Now, in order to investigate this, we would need to understand better the social structure of the other types of communities. So in particular, the established micro-community sign languages, the village sign languages like Katakolok, where the prediction would be that we would have much less varied ages of exposure amongst deaf people in those communities. And also in emerging sign language communities as well. Okay, we need to compare the sociolinguistic situation of these communities to see if this is actually the case. So in summary, the social structure of the BSL and Auslan communities may play a previously unrecognized role in shaping the types of morphological complexities we see in these languages. Together with language age and the iconic properties of language in the visual gestural modality, this key social factor may contribute to the nature of sign language grammar, perhaps in a way that hasn't been fully appreciated until now. And in fact, this is something that the SignMorph project hopes to find out. So if you could show the slide with the research questions from the SignMorph project, that slide, that's the third last slide, please. SignMorph research questions addressing the paradox. Yes, this one. So if you could show the concluding slide now, please. Great. Well, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adam, for this brilliant and very relevant talk. The questions are very provocative. The reflections certainly make us think or rethink about these these established terms, right? As morphological complexity, and also you showed how these data from different types of signing communities have to be considered, but also some sociolinguistic aspects, right? So thank you very much for this brilliant talk. And now I'm going to read some questions that people put in the web chat. So, all right, let me read here. 1 minute. All right. So the first question is from André Xavier. He says, first of all, thank you very much for your great talk. I have 2 questions related to morphological directionality. We see that this feature across at least 2 different word classes. Oh, we see this feature across at least 2 different word classes in sign languages, pronouns and verbs. And we do have signs in Libras that can use directionality, but they are traditionally glossed as nouns, like the sign for name. So they could also be direction, right? Or adjectives like same or weak, equal. Of course, the glosses are not a good hint at a sign morphological class, but is it possible that directionality occurs in word classes other than pronouns and verbs? And the second question is, are there cross-linguistic studies that show a tendency for certain verbs to be directional in sign languages? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very good question. to answer the first question, the second question first, yes, I mean, there's often signs to do with transfer of some kind of metaphorical transfer that are realized as directional or agreement or directional verbs in sign languages. So there does seem to be some similarities across languages, but of course, we do really need to do a lot more work on comparing different sign languages and looking at the different sets of directional verbs across different sign languages. So this is a really interesting question, and one I think that remains to be answered. But I would predict that, yes, there would be some certain degree of semantic predictability for which signs will be directional in this way across different sign languages. But obviously, there are going to be exceptions to this. So you might expect, for example, that particular classes of verbs don't show directionality, but then there's always going to be exceptions to this, I'm sure, cross-linguistically. In terms of the first question, that's a very good question. I think I would normally assume that regardless of the gloss, that if a sign can be directed between locations associated with its arguments, then it's in some sense a verb sign, some kind of verbal sign. But obviously, again, there's been a lot of work on parts of speech categories in sign languages. I mean, there needs to be a lot more work on this topic, to be honest. But I think we have to be very careful about the glosses, okay, and the way that glossing can influence our analysis of signs. I would tend to feel that regardless of the gloss, as I said, if a sign can take arguments and can be directed between locations associated with their arguments, then I would say that this is a type this is verb directionality. I hope that answers the question.
All right. So I think a related question, Adam, is this one made from Carmo. He asks, can we relate grammatical classes with sign language morphology? So how do we identify them?
Yes, I mean, you would have seen me doing that to a certain extent. So talking about reduplication with noun signs to show number contrasts, and reduplication with verb signs to show aspect marking. But I think if you stick to nouns and verbs, you're on fairly safe territory. But once you get into other areas, other types of classes, it becomes quite difficult. So there are other things such as intensification. So where you get, for example, a sign being produced with an initial hold and then a fast release. And often this type of modification occurs both with signs which we might think of as verbal, but also signs which we might think of as adjectival. But again, often it's quite clear when you might want to analyze a particular sign as working as an attributive adjective, but when it comes to predicative adjectives, okay, the distinction between a predicative adjective and a verb is really not clear at all. In many cases, they can take many of the same kinds of alternations. So yes, that's a really good question. As I said, I stuck to distinctions, morphological patterns in nouns and verbs for a reason, and that's because I'm most confident about those kinds of parts of speech in Auslan and BSL than other parts of speech.
All right. As I think there are no more questions from the audience, I will take advantage to do one, right? As the moderator here, so I get. So Adam, I found very interesting that you are going to gather data from different types of signing communities. So I was just thinking that in countries with continental size like Brazil, we have to take into account what is urban and what would be rural, you know, in terms of geographical distances and urbanistic patterns. So for example, from what we have in Europe and Africa. So when you say like the established sign language group, would you consider only the urban centers? And also just to add, you know, there are some places where they are not actually urban centers, but they may have some institutions in which deaf people can acquire the language, like deaf association. So is there any predicted effect for these community settings for the sociolinguistic typological view that you are assuming?
Really good question. For the purposes of the project, I talked about these three categories, but like any kind of category we have in linguistics, creating these kinds of categories is problematic. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So I used examples that kind of are prototypical examples of each category. So for example, the Katakolok versus BSL versus Nicaraguan Sign Language. So these are kinds of prototypes of those categories. We are seeing now that that obviously these three types do not represent all the types that we have. We've got all different types that occur between those prototypes. So for example, my colleague, Lauren Reed in Australia is looking at sign languages in Papua New Guinea, and in particular, what seems to be something that challenges the distinction between a kind of community sign language and a home sign language. So we're getting networks of individual signers across certain villages in Papua New Guinea that seem to be using related forms of a particular sign language, okay? Even though there's not that much contact between them. So we do see a lot more complexity, to use that word, the word du jour, in terms of these categories. So I'm sure that I know that in Brazil, you have sign languages that fit into some of these categories. So I believe that Libras would, as an urban sign language, would fit in more or less into the established macro community sign language. But obviously, as you say, in the rural parts of Brazil, many deaf people do not access Libras, okay? And so there are other types of signing communities and also home signers in many parts of Brazil. So you've got a lot more complicated a picture in a country like Brazil than you have, for example, in the UK. So yes, I'm very aware that these categories are themselves problematic. I've chosen very clear examples. I think that the SignMorph project hopes to look at these clearest examples in order to be able to investigate the key features, the feature of language age, the feature of social structure, and the feature of iconicity. So in order to be able to test for those factors and the influence on the sign languages in those communities, we have to look for types of language that are maximally distinct from each other. So that doesn't mean, of course, that signing communities come in all sorts of more complex combinations of those factors. I have my former PhD student, Rose Stamp, for example, is based in Israel, and Israel is another country where you've got a very complex sociolinguistic situation. So you have emerging sign languages and an established sign language within the same nation state. And I suspect that this is the case in many parts of the world outside the global north, countries like the UK and Australia.
All right, thank you, Adam. One final comment is from Sara Siavoshi. She says, thanks for the great talk. I don't have a question, but the talk made me think about the new social change and their effect on sign language morphology. So it would be interesting to find out the effects of video chat conversation as a recent social factor on sign language morphology, because deaf people could not communicate from afar until recently, like less than 10 years in Iran, for example. I think she's from Iran. The language change in transition is way faster than before in deaf communities, especially in places like Iran, that deaf schools are not common. So would like to comment, Adam, on this?
Yeah, absolutely. There is increased contact between signing communities. I don't know about the situation in Iran, but certainly even in the UK, the increased contact, we have looked at lexical variation and change in BSL, in British Sign Language, and we looked at different categories, different semantic domains in the lexicon of BSL. So we looked at semantic domains in which there's a lot of regional variation in BSL. So color signs in particular vary a lot in BSL. Number signs vary a lot as well in BSL from different regions. And country signs, signs for countries, other countries, vary a lot as well. And it's in the domain of signs for countries that we've seen the most rapid change in the BSL lexicon. So we have seen a lot of influence from international contact, so that many signers in the BSL community, in the signing community, now use signs borrowed from other sign languages to refer to that country. So America is the most famous example. Okay, so we have in BSL a number of traditional signs for America. I can show you two. Okay, and both of those signs have changed, and now we get this sign for the United States of America from American Sign Language. And our research shows that this change has occurred quite rapidly, and a large number of signers now use this as their preferred sign. And that's, of course, because of international contact. And this was data that was collected 10 years ago, okay, before the widespread use of online communication. So you're absolutely right. The language change that is occurring now probably is even more rapid because of increased contact between signing communities. So it would be really great to go back and collect more data from BSL to see how that change has continued to happen, and to see whether the rate of change in some areas of the lexicon is increasing because of this increased contact.
All right. So I think we are moving toward the end of this talk. I just want to do some acknowledgement. We want to thank again our invited speaker, Professor Adam, for this brilliant and very relevant talk. I want to thank the audience for their participation and the questions that they sent to our speaker. I want to thank the interpreters, Christopher Stone, Naomi Burney, Mala Poi, Audrey Uloa, Guilherme Lourenço, Hannah Beer, Marcus Luque, and Leticia Tobal for providing this wonderful accessibility for this lecture and for the deaf people audience. So I just want to emphasize the importance of everyone to become a member of the Abralin Association in order to strengthen some brilliant initiatives like these projects that are happening now. So please spread the conference links to those who were not able to attend live to this conference. And I want to end asking Professor Adam Schembri to say his final words.
Well, thanks again to all the interpreters. Thank you so much. Thank you again to Abralin for the invitation, and also to LAGB, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, for inviting me to participate in this series. I'm sorry about the technical hitches with I don't know why we couldn't share this. I couldn't control the screen sharing. I'm sorry about that, but I hope that showing the slides didn't interrupt the flow of the talk too much. But thank you for your attention. And goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.